Well, good evening, everybody. I started the recording, and this talk will be available for the next month or so, and we'll send that out to everybody. Before we get going with our speaker, Dr. Irina Stotland, I'd like to make a couple of quick announcements. First of all, thank you all so much for renewing your RAL membership, and without your renewal, we can't do, these presentations. We can't have our juried shows and other shows. And of the 200 active members last year, more than nearly half, about 96 of you, have already renewed. And thank you. That's a great showing, a week into September. And I'm sure the rest of the folks will join as well. We always have room for new members. So tell your friends, either artists or art lovers, that they're welcome. And instructions on how to renew or join are on the website. Next thing, I saw that so many of you were represented in the multiple Labor Day art shows. And it just made me proud to see so many of our artists winning prizes, selling their work, just showing how talented they were. You all did us proud. Thank you. This week, earlier this week, our Sunflower show came down and ended, and I was really sad to see it go. That show brought such joy and recognition for the Rockville Art League, and lots of sales. And of those sales, a number of them, more than 9 of the artists selling, there were 13 sales in all, but 9 of those had committed to donating proceeds to charities favoring or helping with the situation in Ukraine. So not only are you talented, but you're very generous. So that show came down, but our next show is up and ready to be seen. It's called 9 Select Artists. It's beautiful. It's a blend of lots of mediums, from photography to collage to oil to watercolors. There's even a sculpture in there. It's just great. It's both representational and abstract. And the virtual show is up and ready to be seen, and you can get to it via the RockvilleArtLeague.org website. There's a button where you can click to view that show. And by the way, when you click it, it takes you to something called Artwork Archive, and the 9 Select Artists show is front and center. Lisa has put in there when the hours of the mansion are open. It's open. And also, since it is a meeting venue or a wedding venue, there are some times when the venue is closed, and she lists those as she hears about it. But mostly it's open Monday through Friday, 9 to 4:30. And it's a beautiful show. I hope you see it. When you go in to the virtual show, you're in Artwork Archive, and on the left, there is something called exhibitions. And if you click that exhibition button, you'll see other exhibitions that are still up virtually. And that includes, our Sunflower show, which is still virtual. Our spring juried show is still there, the one that Dr. Stotland judged for us. Lost, Found, and Looking Forward is up as well. So please feel free to take a look. And have I left anything out, Lisa? I think that's what I wanted to share.
That's great. Those are beautiful shows, and have a look if you want to,
And Lisa did her magic curating it so that the work just looks beautiful together, as it always does.
And we do have sales past the show end because of these virtual shows. So that's
Yeah.
good. Before we get going any further, could we ask that a few of you mute your mic, because we are recording. So make sure you mute your mic if you haven't done it already. Do you know how to do that? Because I'll ask you in a minute. Thank you. Got one more person.
Also, if you have comments or questions, if you could type them into the chat. Lisa will be reviewing those as we go. And, you know, at some point, Dr. Stotland may decide to open it up, or may ask you to unmute, whatever. But, you know, there is an opportunity to ask questions as we go, and Lisa will be monitoring the chat function. So I am so glad that we have Dr. Irina Stotland with us again. This is, I believe, your 6th year, kicking off our you know, RAL year in September. That's great, and we're so glad to have you. We've also asked Irina to help us with other things. I mentioned she's judged some shows. She's spoken to us 6 times in a row, 6 years in a row. She offered a special presentation to benefit the effort, you know, to help Ukraine. So that's all great. Dr. Stotland got her PhD in art history at Bryn Mawr. She specialized, or her area of focus was post-impressionism. And more specifically, she's a recognized expert on Paul Gauguin. She's published an article recently in something called Gauguin's Challenge, New Perspectives After Postmodernism. And I think she spoke on Gauguin's self-portraits. She teaches at Montgomery College. She teaches at the Yellow Barn. As I've said, she supported us for many years. She's a wonderful speaker and a wonderful person. So, Irina, I'll just turn it over to you now. Thanks.
Let me just share. Whoops, no. Let's see, sorry about this.
There, it's coming up.
Okay. Okay, so if everybody except for Lisa and Patrick can mute yourselves, and as Patrick said, if you can write your questions into the chat room, then I can manage our time a little bit better. I will talk for about 75 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. Okay, so just because we have a lot of participants, if everybody wants to ask me a question while I'm talking, we'll probably never finish, which is a good thing, but also a bad thing. Okay, so today's subject, the subject of today's lecture is abstract expressionism. And since we're limited in time, I've chosen 3 sort of giants of the movement, Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and Mark Rothko. So this is a brief but hopefully comprehensive overview of what the movement stands for and what is the aesthetic objective of the sort of the movement in general and each of the artists within it in particular. And my hope is that after this lecture, when you see these paintings, if you didn't know this before, you'll have a sort of an understanding of their meaning and the purpose, the intended sort of message of the artist in creating them. So to understand what abstract expressionism is, you have to start in the 18th century, actually, with this book by a Scottish philosopher by the name of Edmund Burke, who publishes a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. And he publishes it in 1757. And he basically comes up with this philosophical concept of the sublime. The sublime is, as he puts it, the greatness beyond all possibility of calculation, measurement, of imitation, which basically means that anything that exceeds our understanding, the understanding of a human mind, terror, death, infinity, power, eternity, astonishment. So things, ideas that we as rational, logical beings cannot really comprehend. All of these things are examples of the sublime. So that's what that philosophical idea is there from the 18th century. Where we get it sort of translated into art in America is the sort of the mid half of the 19th century. Somebody like Frederick Church, you see the image on your screen. This is Heart of the Andes from 1859, and this is the idea of the sublime. So here we have the sublime of nature, right? Landscape that is all of these things like infinity, power, vastness, that defy our powers of understanding, and yet they exist, but they are beyond our ability to comprehend them. So what happens in the 20th century, what happens with this is where abstract expressionism really comes out of, is you have a lot of catastrophes, basically. You have World War II, you have the Holocaust, you have the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So all of these things truly defy our comprehension. They are beyond understanding. They are catastrophic on such a scale that we don't truly understand them. And so because these events change the world so much, there is, as there always is, there is such a thing in the previous events where that happens. You have to have a new visual language that comments on that seismic change. And so this is a quote from Jackson Pollock. "It seems to me that the modern painter cannot express his age, the airplane, the atom bomb, the radio, in the old forms of the Renaissance or any other past culture. Each age finds its own technique. And for these artists, that technique, that new visual language, is the language of abstraction. And for them, it becomes the most universal expression of the transcending experience, of the sublime experience." And from Frederick Church, you then move down to the bottom of your screen, and you see Pollock's Convergence from 1952 that basically expresses the same concept of the sublime, just in the modern era. So we're going to see how they do it. And they do it in two ways, these artists. So there is this overarching label of abstract expressionism. It is an American style, but you have two schools within it. One is earlier, one is later. So the first school is the action painting, and that's abstract expressionism of the 1940s and 1950s. And then the later school is the color field painting, and that's the 50s and the 60s. So for both of them, there are certain common elements. This is how we recognize abstract expressionism. It's non-representational, meaning you don't really, the objective is not to copy anything from nature. All of these works are monumental in size, large canvases. And all of them have the so-called, we're going to talk about this, all over painting. So the whole canvas is painted. You don't have, margins left, and you also don't have a central element, that's sort of the peripheral elements. All of the canvas is treated with equal measure. Everything is of equal importance. So while you have abstract expressionism in America, you have basically the same movement in Europe. It just has a different name. It's called lyrical abstraction. And you have people like Yves Klein, Jean Dubuffet, Nicolas de Stael that are representative of the school. But usually we're associated with America. So the most famous American abstract expressionist is obviously Jackson Pollock. Here he is. He is born in Wyoming and he dies in New York at the age of 44. So I am 44 at the moment. So it's sort of jarring to realize that. And he dies in a drunk, as a result of a drunk driving accident. He drives into a tree. He is a son of a farmer. His father is a farmer and a land surveyor, and his mother is a dressmaker, sort of an artistic profession there. And he doesn't just grow up in Wyoming, he also spent some time in Arizona and California. And he comes to New York in 1930. He is 18, and he becomes part of the Art Student League. 6 years later, he has this profound sort of encounter with one of the most famous Mexican muralists. So an artist that paints huge paintings, right? Murals. His name is David Alfaro Siqueiros, and we're going to talk about this. And that is what sort of starts out his path on the road to abstract expressionism and on the road to these larger than life, engulfing monumental artworks. He becomes part of the Federal Art Project, WPA. This is how he's employed. He also starts therapy. It's a Jungian psychotherapy, and he starts out going to the therapist because of his alcoholism, which ultimately results in his death, really. But this idea, the Jungian idea of the archetypes that's the theory that they are the basis of the whole culture, and we have these ideas as part of our collective subconscious. So the universal ideas are there in the world, you just need to sort of realize them. That is happening late 30s, early 40s. In the late 40s, he establishes himself as the abstract expressionist. He pioneers placing his canvases on the floor, which has never happened before in the history of art. He pioneers the so-called drip technique, and that connects to his idea of himself as an artist, which he puts in as I am nature. So this sort of non-conscious, automated sort of manner of painting. He becomes very famous. 1949, on the bottom of your screen, this is one of the 4 pages in Life magazine. So that's sort of at the height of his fame. He is nevertheless still a very depressed man. He goes through a darker period where he switches from an already sort of restricted color palette. During this time, he switches to all black pourings paintings in 1951, where he also tries to move away from pure abstraction and sort of balance abstraction and figurative representation. And it's not popular, it doesn't work out. So he is truly championed. What you have during this period is also this sort of heroic driving force of an art critic and an art collector. So you have 2 people that truly champion Jackson Pollock, and it's the New York art critic Clement Greenberg, who basically creates a theoretical basis for abstract expressionism, and Peggy Guggenheim, obviously, does a lot to sort of bolster the fame of abstract expressionism. So what I want to start with, and we're going to go through that with all of the 3 painters, I wanted to start with their sources, because a lot of people are very frustrated when they looked at abstract expressionists. And I find that frustration has to do with a sort of semi-conscious idea that the viewers have that these guys cannot paint. They cannot draw, they cannot paint, they're trying to sort of trick us. So I really like showing the evolution of these artists, and to combat this idea of a swindle. These are serious artists. They're very intentional what they're doing, and there is a development of their style that you can see if you just care to listen to a lecture, for example. So this is one of his stylistic sources. This is when he meets and works with David Alfaro Siqueiros. This is Sequeira's painting on the top called Cosmos and Disaster over here in 1936. And it's a painting that has to do with Spanish Civil War, the photographs of the trenches during World War I. And he is experimenting with different mediums. So he's using not just paint here, but also sand is embedded in the painting, splinters. And he's using these interesting techniques like airbrushing and drippings. And this is what Pollock is doing basically at the same time, 1936-37. This is landscape with the steer. And you can sort of see the representational aspects of it. It's not truly abstract, nor is Sequeira's painting. You can see the trenches, right? You can see the structures over there. But it's these dramatic, expansive vistas of colors and shapes. And although there is some figuration and representation there, mostly they're evocative, right? You sort of read them by free association with color and with shapes that you perceive here. So Pollock is becoming increasingly experimental. And he's here using much, much brighter, more saturated colors. So that's the first, well, I would say that's not the first, the second phase. The first phase is American regionalism, when Pollock was truly painting figurative paintings about Wild, Wild West. Then he goes through this phase where he's looking at Expressionism, a movement of the 20th century. He's specifically looking at German Expressionism that has to do with World War I, with the rise of the Nazi party in Germany. So this is Max Beckham, The Night from 1918-1919, and it has to do with society's descent into violence and madness. So you have this family who was having dinner at this table, and their supper is interrupted by these assailants, three assailants. One, the head of the household is being killed by hanging. His wife, there is a suggestion of sexual violence here. A child is being kidnapped on the right. So it's about disillusionment. It's about society's sort of propensity to violence and destruction, but it is also highly expressive, very sort of subjective vision of reality, right? It's not, in terms of shapes and colors, these are not naturalistic elements here. So some 20 years later, this is what Pollock is doing, Naked Man with Knife, 1938, 1940. And you can sort of, you can recognize the human form. You obviously see the knife over here, but again, this is a vision of violence and destruction. And again, it's very subjective, very sort of symbolic and allegoric in nature. Then Pollock goes through the phase of sort of working through Cubism, specifically Pablo Picasso's Cubism. So there is Pablo Picasso on your left, Mademoiselles d'Avignon from 1907. Pollock sees this at MoMA. And so Picasso's piece is from 1907, Pollock's is 1944. So just about at the end of World War II. What is he taking from Picasso? The idea of Cubism is of fragmenting reality. They are taking the world apart and they are showing us the sort of the invisible structures that underlay the reality as we perceive it with our eyes. So Cubism truly decentralizes the viewer. So the traditional position of the viewer would be front and center in front of, say, a Renaissance oil. In a Cubist painting, vis-a-vis the Cubist painting, a viewer has a moving position. And as you know, the painting is showing us, each object is shown to us from multiple viewpoints. So you have the simultaneous perception of the body, for example, which fragments it. The body falls apart and never sort of comes back together. So this is what you see in Pollock as well. You have these sort of forms that have fragmented, the world has splintered. And that is what we're seeing here in the Gothic from 1944. So Surrealism has a profound influence on abstract expressionism and on Pollock specifically. On the left is Juan Miró, which Pollock admired as much as he admired Picasso. And this is Ciphers and Constellations, In Love with a Woman, 1941. On the right is Pollock's There Was 7 and 8, 1945. So the reason there is such a big influence from the European artists on the American artists is because of World War II, because there is an influx of refugees, specifically to New York, which then lets the American artists study and learn and see all of these things. So what Pollock is writing during this time, he says, I choose to veil the imagery. So here he starts with snakes, eyes, faces, and then he covers them up by lines and colors. He's also is reading this very important book during this time called Totem Art, that's published in 1943 by Wolfgang Palan. And Palan says, basically formulates this philosophy that art should not represent. Paintings, he says, no longer represent. Painting no longer represents. It has become the role of the painting to look at the spectator and ask him, what do you represent? So it's not about copying the reality, it's about the subjective vision of reality, which is very much determined by your own internal sort of perceptions. Finally, and most closely to abstract expressionism, we have the movement, the European movement of abstraction, that is, we usually say that it gets started or it gets more famous with Wassily Kandinsky. So this is Wassily Kandinsky composition 7 from 1913. The earliest pure abstraction is introduced by Kandinsky. And this idea of absolute subjectivity, shape and color and line are not there to copy reality, they're there to represent the emotional sort of subjective truth of the painter and to try to evoke the same thing in the viewer. So without abstraction, we really wouldn't have abstract expressionism. So there is Pollock over here becoming very, very abstract, losing any sort of reference to reality. This is called shimmering substance. And this is his response to him moving to the rural East Hampton. And this is about light and color. And he's also, Pollock is very much influenced by his partner at the time, Lee Krasner, who marries him as well. And she's a wonderful painter. So this is 1947 by Lee Krasner. And you really see the connection between the two. So this is very briefly the evolution of Pollock. Now, where we truly get abstract expression is when Pollock goes to an exhibition, which is put on at MoMA, of the Native American sand painting. And the idea of sand painting has to do with healing. You have the medicine man and the patient inside the sand painting, and the medicine man lets the color sand flow through his fingers, and there are these holy people, which he's painting, that are going to absorb the illness. This exhibition is at MoMA in 1941. And this, from that point on, it sort of gives Pollock the permission to do what he wants to do. And what he wants to do is this. He puts the canvas on the floor, just like sand painting is on the floor. And he treats this canvas as an arena in which to act. And his movements of, his arm and wrist movements are the painterly gestures. What it does, this approach to painting, is it's no longer about the finished painting, and it is now about the process of creation, the process of painting. And the paint drips and the paint flows, and it becomes both an unconscious creation, because you can't truly control everything, but there is an element of consciousness as well, because he's choosing where paint goes and how sort of weighty the flow of the paint is. So the painting, the end result, they called it the objectness. The physicality of the surface becomes a document. It sort of preserves the existential struggle of the painter. That is what abstract expressionism is. So there is an example of Jackson Pollock. This one is at MoMA. He doesn't title his paintings. Very early on, he shifts to numbers and years because he doesn't want the viewer to look for meaning, for representational meaning. So this is number 1A, 1948, because this is the year of its creation. And he uses all sorts of techniques to create it. He uses a brush, he uses a stick. Sometimes he pours the paint out of the can. Sometimes he drips the paint onto the canvas, and he creates these really cosmic, sublime images. If we're going back to the sublime, this is beyond our rational comprehension. It creates a feeling, and it's a feeling, it's an image of the subconscious of the artist. When I'm in my painting, Pollock writes, I'm not aware of what I'm doing. I try to let it come through. It is only when I lose contact with the painting that the result is a mess. Otherwise, there is pure harmony. So there's the fluidity of paint, which really captures the way that his body moves. You have the visibility of him creating. You have handprints. For example, here, oh, I'm sorry, in the upper right over here, this is the handprint that you can see that he was there. So it's sort of an embodied creation. And the whole of it is very rhythmic. There is light, dark, thick, thin, heavy, light. So all of these things are there. So it's harmony and it's subconscious. So it is truly sort of the sublime of the cosmos. At least it reminds me of space when I look at this. Another example, Blue Poles. So that's a descriptive title, which was then changed to number 11, 1952. Again, if you look at this painting closely, you're going to see footprints, you're going to see embedded pieces of glass. And you have this pattern, the blue poles, the pattern that overlay this chaos, which is basically human order over chaotic cosmos. So we do derive pleasure from seeing things like this, sort of an order brought into chaos. Convergence from 1952. You have the embedded nails, coins, you even have a match because he would smoke during painting things. He starts in black and white because this is the period where he goes dark and he does the black pourings. But here he is sort of synthesizing the old and the new. So he does black and white first, and then the outer layer is color that he adds to it. Okay, so this is very briefly Jackson Pollock. The next artist is William de Kooning, and he actually, unlike Pollock, who is born and bred in America, de Kooning he's born in Netherlands, and he is an apprentice to a commercial artist, and then he starts out taking classes at the Art Academy at Rotterdam in Netherlands. In the 1926, when he's 21 years old, he sneaks onto a British freighter that is going to US, and he becomes a stowaway. So he's truly an illegal immigrant that comes to America from this war torn Europe after World War I, and he settles in New York. He becomes a house painter. He does commercial art. 1928, he is in Woodstock, which is the artistic colony at the time in New York. This is where he meets Arshil Gorky, who is another immigrant from Armenia, escaping the Armenian genocide to America. And Arshil Gorky has a very large impact on de Kooning's evolution, as we will see. Just like Pollock, he's employed by the Federal Art Project of the Works Progress Administration, this huge federal undertaking that gives jobs to artists in 1930s. And he is a philosopher. He writes and speaks about the aesthetics of the movement and the concepts of the movement. And he establishes this artistic club on the 8th Street, East 8th Street in New York. And it includes all of these sort of luminaries in the organization. So unlike Pollock is purely abstract. All of these cosmically sublime paintings have no reference to the observable reality. They're sort of larger than what we can see. So unlike Pollock, de Kooning never breaks with figuration. He never breaks with representation. And so he's much more of an expressionist in the abstract expressionism than the abstract artist. There we have two words in the name of the movement. So for him, he describes the objective of his painting as the emotion of an experience. So this is what he's trying to convey, the experience and the emotion. And I think the easiest way to understand de Kooning is by thinking about the sublime of the body. It could be the flesh of the body, or it could be sort of the experience of the body in nature. This is the way that he creates his landscapes. But just like Pollock, de Kooning starts with different things. So here is sort of, I wanted to do this comparison when he was influenced by Henri Matisse and Fauvism. So this is Henri Matisse's Seville Still Life. This is Still Life by de Kooning from 1916. So 6 years in between them. So obviously de Kooning can paint, as you can see from here. Then he goes through a surrealist stage. Again, he's looking at Miro. This is Miro's Spanish Dancer. This is de Kooning's Untitled. There is this sort of, surrealism is all about subconscious. It's about the theories of Sigmund Freud. It's about the sort of automatic, letting the subconscious speak, let it paint, automated drawing and painting, these sort of things. And the idea of a dream object, an object taken out of context, a surrealist object. He then again grows, just like Paula goes through this phase of looking at Cubist artists and Expressionist artists. So this is de Kooning, 1947-48. This is Untitled of 3 figures. This is actually at Glenstone. So you can go see it if you can get the tickets. And he's looking at a German expressionist, a very famous one, Emil Nolde. This is Dance Around the Golden Cuff. You can obviously see the similarities there. And he's looking at Picasso's Mademoiselles d'Avignons. Nobody can escape that painting, especially because it's at MoMA and they can truly see it. So Expressionism is about angst, it's about emotion. Expressionism is also, just like the Fauves, it is about color, and color carrying this emotional charge, conveying it to the viewer. Cubism, as I said, is about disintegration. It's about the fragmentation of the world. And you can see both of them in de Kooning of that period. I wanted to specifically look at Arshile Gorky, who is part abstraction, part surrealism. So this is Arshile Gorky's Agony. And then there's sort of a suggestion of a man who committed suicide by hanging himself here. And red, which is the predominant color in this composition, is all about pain and anger and suffering. This is 1947. And there is de Kooning from a year later. This is the Phillips collection. Again, we can go see it. So for de Kooning, color is all important. Pollock has a much more restricted color palette. Pollock is expressive through gesture, through line, through sort of the movement of his arm. For de Kooning, color, the saturation of color, the intensity of color is a very, very important element, which is sort of not as predominant as it is in Pollock, not as predominant in Pollock. So the most important series of William de Kooning, the most famous one, are the 3 paintings he does called Women. Woman 1, Woman 2, Woman 3. So the Women series. This is the first work in the series, which is at MoMA, 1950 to 52. So this is a very interesting painting, because if you think about abstract expressionism, the whole revolutionary nature of it is that they declare the figure absolute. They say we're no longer representing things. We're just going to do pure abstraction. So when de Kooning does something like this, it's a recognizable, it's a distorted, right, fragmented, but a recognizable human body. He is going back to the expressionism, and he is returning to figuration, and he is seen as a traitor to the movement to a degree. But for de Kooning, it's a reconcilable thing, abstraction and figuration. You don't need to pick one or another. So what is abstracted here? So we see, he says even abstract shapes must have a likeness. So we do have a face, you don't have a chest, you have the legs here, but then you also have line and color that obliterate recognition, right? There's this aggressive brushwork, abrupt strokes in multiple directions. You have these jarring combinations of color. And in a lot of ways, line and color in de Kooning are independent of what they're representing. Color is not there to describe. Color is its own sort of agent in his paintings. So what are we seeing here? He describes it as the idol, the Venus, the nude. We're seeing a life-sized, centralized, dominant female nude, which is a traditional trope of the Western art history. She is in de Kooning angry, vengeful, the sort of hulking monster who is equal part sort of sexualized and what's the word, monstrosized. And he is obviously looking at the history of art in the depiction of the nude, starting with the Venus of Willendorf, the Paleolithic, one of the earliest representations of the female body that we have. This is Paul Gauguin from the 19th century. This is Oviri, which translates as savage. And of course, again, Picasso's Mademoiselles d'Avignons. So for a male artist to centralize a female body, a nude, to make her a monster, right? A sexual monster. That is a very sort of traditional approach to representation. So she's a focus of desire and also of frustration. She's a threat here. So when you get to the third painting in the series, I'm not showing you the second because of the time limitations. So he calls it Woman 6. Well, there are more than 3, basically. I misspoke. This is 1953. This is the last one in the series. And if you compare the last one with the first one, what do you notice? The woman has been obliterated. The woman that we see more or less clearly in this painting has been erased. So you have the effacement of the face. You can sort of tell that this is the face with the 2 eyes coming through. You have no hands and feet anymore. The question becomes, who is the aggressor? Is it the woman who is this dominating monstrous personality, or is she the victim? Is she under attack, being obliterated by this male violence? So it's a very sort of, in terms of psychoanalysis, psychoanalytical art history, it's a very interesting series to analyze. In late 1950s, de Kooning briefly abandons the figure and he starts to paint these wonderful landscapes, which are a little bit easier to digest, I find, for the viewer. So they're not representative, again. It's not like you recognize a tree, but they are evocations of landscapes. And they are full of these wonderful colors, vibrant, saturated colors. So this is a tree in Naples, 1960. This is at MoMA. And they wanted to put it next to Claude Monet's Blue Water Lilies, because that is what de Kooning is looking at. That sort of tradition of painting is very much at the forefront of de Kooning's mind. Abstract expressionism doesn't throw away the art history. It just it translates them into the modern terms of the 20th century sublime. So for the Impressionists, the objective was to capture the fleeting moment of light as a metaphor for modernity. That is precisely what de Kooning is doing here. He's just doing it in a different way. His visual vocabulary is different. So we don't no longer recognize, the lilies or the leaves that drip into the water. We no longer even see water as water. But there is an evocation of this blue expanse, right? Which, if you get the title, A Tree in Naples, you start to sort of look for the tree, right? And the water in here. So very much simplified, very expansive brush strokes. He's using house paint brushes here, and very painterly, very fluid. So you do get a captured moment here. He then returns to the representation of women, and that is truly his love. He says, flesh is the reason oil paint was invented, and by flesh he means a figure of a woman. And so we get these women walking, sitting, swimming. This is nude figure woman on the beach, 1963. This is at the Guggenheim, and they wanted to put it next to Renoir to just show you that connection remains unbroken. So there is Renoir, the two bathers in the landscape, a late Renoir from 1919, and this is de Kooning from 1963. Again, the premise is sort of similar. The visual vocabulary is different. It's translated with the different sort of context within the different reality of existence in the 20th century. So what do you have in Renoir? It's the body that is dissolving into paint, right? You have these wonderful colors that merge into each other. You have this impressionistic feather-like touch and painterliness. You have the same thing in de Kooning. There is sort of the intimation of the body seated over here. The pinkish color is the flesh, right? She's surrounded by what seems to be sand and water and some sort of foliage over here. It's the body, just like in Renoir, that is unstable, that is dissolving, that is floating, that is becoming part of the landscape. With de Kooning, it's never just the landscape, it's about the sort of the experience of the landscape via the body. And here, of course, you have this long, this old metaphor of a female body as nature. Okay, the last figure that I'm going to talk about very briefly is Mark Rothko. He is Jewish. He's born into a Jewish family. His father is a pharmacist, and he's born in the Pale of Settlement, so on the outskirts of the Russian Empire, what is now Latvia. He comes to Portland. He is in Yale on scholarship, and then he goes to New York. He's at Parsons, where he meets Arshil Gorky, and he sees these two very important exhibitions at MoMA, Cubism and Abstract Art, and Fantastic Art, Dada, and Surrealism, which basically put him on a path to Abstract Expressionism. And he, of course, is interested in Jung and the archetypes. So in 1946, he comes up with this idea of the multiform paintings. And he looks at these multiforms, he describes them as fields of possibilities. He is the first abstract expressionist to have a dedicated museum space, and it is right here at the Phillips Collection. You have the Rothko rooms, which I encourage you to go visit. And he also has a dedicated chapel, the Rothko Chapel, which is in Texas, which is designed to his specifications and has all of his paintings in it. So he defines his objective as painting is not about an experience, it is an experience. So again, he goes through Fauvism and Expressionism as a stage. So this is Matisse and Nolde over here, and this is early Rothko at our National Gallery. And for Rothko, it is all about color. Color without figuration in de Kooning. Color more than it is in Pollock. You became color, you became totally saturated with it as if it were music. That is what Rothko says about color. This is his surrealistic stage. He is mostly inspired by Paul Klee. Paul Klee does these paintings that are inspired by children's art, he creates these biomorphic forms that combine nature and machines. And that is what Rothko is interested in as well. This is his archaic idol, 1945 at MoMA. He's also influenced by Hans Hofmann, another European refugee who's an abstract artist and who talks about vibrating space. So this is Hans Hofmann, and this is Rothko during the same period. And so Rothko is a representative of the second school, the later school of abstract expressionism called color field painting. And the way color field painting is different from action painting, it's not about the gesture, it's not about the action of your arm and wrist, it's about a large area of several large areas of a single color. And each painting is a monolith. The credo of color field painting is to preserve the integrity of the picture plane. And we're going to see how this works. There is no reference to the recognizable world. There is no gestural or painterly marks. There is no individuality. It's all about color. It's about the psychology of color. So for Rothko, it's about the sublime of color. Color carries the message, color carries the emotion. And he creates truly monumental paintings. And he explains why he chose to do them so large. He says that historically, large paintings were seen as pompous, right? They were all about status. For him, the large size is about creating the intimate relationship between the painting and the viewer, because he sees if the larger they are, the more engulfed the viewer is in them. So he says it reduces the distance between the piece and the viewer. So 1947 is when he comes up with this idea of multiforms as a compositional structure, and he sticks with it for 23 years. So you have these rectangular blocks of color, large expanses, the sort of loose zones in the composition, and there's this visual complexity that is created by shape and color. But in Rothko, color and shape are inseparable. Color creates the shape, shape creates color, layering of color creates depth. There is a sort of, the more you look at Rothko, the more you understand there is a sense of movement. These blocks move out and backward. They sort of vibrate against each other because he uses complementary color contrasts that work off of each other. There is the visibility of the creation process. The layering and the dissolution is laid bare to us. The variations of color and tone are eternal, sort of, and they evoke these numerous moods, numerous atmospheres in the viewer. And he says, I think of my pictures as dramas. The shapes and the pictures are the performers. This is his philosophy of art. This is basically sort of as a list of ingredients on a cooking show. This is what he says you need to create a painting. There must be a clear preoccupation with death, intimations of mortality, sensuality, our basis of being concrete about the world, tension, either conflict or curbed desire, irony, this is a modern ingredient, the self-effacement and examination by which a man for an instant can go on to something else, wit and play for the human element, the ephemeral and chance for the human element, and hope, 10% to make the tragic concept more endurable. So this is Orange, Red, and Yellow from 1961. And it has all of these ingredients, theoretically. Red is for the power, blood, right? That stands for fire. So it's a symbol of, it's symbolic of life, death, and spirit. And for Rothko, art is something that fills a void that's been left in the modern psyche. We've lost our religion, we've lost our myths, right? Our mythology. So this sort of transcendence of an individual, the sublime of color, fills that void, the spiritual void. This mythic form becomes a new language for us. This is at the National Gallery of Art. This is from 1970, entitled, and he creates it after he has a heart attack. And this is a quote from him: "The fact that a lot of people break down and cry when confronted with my picture shows that I can communicate those basic human emotions. The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them." So what is this? It's reduced to the barest sort of element, right? You have just black and gray, and they are emotions, tragedy in pure form. It evokes desolation, it evokes loneliness, it evokes pain, perhaps fear of death. It reads as a landscape because we're sort of preconditioned with our brain sort of development to read horizontally arranged forms as a landscape. So basically, it's a wasteland, right? You have a dividing horizon, but it is sort of a landscape of hell. It's boundless, it's limitless, it's insubstantial. It is the sublime of color. Okay, I think, yes, so this is it. I'm gonna open this up for discussion. Let me see. I have no questions in the chat room as of now. If anybody wants to, hold on. If anybody wants to speak or ask me a question, this is the time to do it. Please unmute yourself to do so.
Irina,
Yes.
thank you very much. Could you share a little bit about these artists' personal life? Like, I know, for example, that Pollock was impoverished, and he lived in a house with no heat, and de
Right.
Kooning would live in a studio, which would be in the attic spaces of these row houses in New York City. I mean,
They were not financially secure, which is sort of part of this whole avant-garde mythology. You are not supposed to be doing well. If you are, at the avant-garde of an artistic movement, that you are a revolutionary, which is why Pollock truly became this mythical figure. He was an alcoholic. He suffered his whole life. He was in pain basically his whole life, and he died at 44. So he checks off all the marks. They also were notoriously not stable in their personal relationships, if I can put it that way. Lee Krasner, there's also an element of sort of this, in the way that we look now at abstract expressionism is, I think, more realistic than people used to do it because of the feminist sort of prism that we now acquired. The optics are different. So we are starting to talk about their partners who were not just their partners and their wives, but also truly great artists in their own right, like Lee Krasner, who was Pollock's wife, like Elaine de Kooning, who I know you love, who was an incredible artist. For the longest time, it was just about their personal sort of tumultuous relationships. That was the angle. And now we no longer, we're trying to sort of move away from that invisibility. Does that answer your question?
well, what about later in their life? I mean, once they became famous and collected by Guggenheim, et cetera, did they have some vestige of security later on?
I think for Pollock, he just died so young. He did have some obvious benefits of his fame, but I think Rothko was doing fairly well in the later years, and de Kooning as well. They were both considered to be these very important people in the modern art. So I think it was better towards the end of their life.
Yeah.
Dr. Stotland,
Yes.
my name is Jorge Bernal. I want to thank you. It was a wonderful presentation. The
Thank you.
questions that I have while I was looking at Rothko, I've always liked his use of colors, is, the soft edges or tones. When I compare that to the hard edges that Joseph Albers used, and
Yeah.
how he developed colors and the contrast with his colors, or his studies in colors, are amazing. But can you tell us a little bit about how Rothko went about choosing colors? Was it purely emotion? Did he have any thoughts or schooling behind it?
Well, I mean, as you saw, is like hopefully I showed you the stylistic evolution. That I think it makes clear that they were highly educated, sort of visually highly educated people. They studied all of these movements. So Rothko obviously understands the way color works. He understands the color theory. You can see how he uses complementary contrast colors, right? So to make them vibrate, to make some colors recede, another pop. And I think the same goes for the symbolism of color. Like, for example, black and gray, right? So in the West, this would be associated with pain and suffering and death rather than, something more optimistic. And if you look at the previous painting, the same here as well, right? As I was saying, what are our associations with color red? Passion, blood, fire, right?
Right.
So if that's what you're asking, I don't know. I don't remember reading if he ever sort of laid it out and specified his vocabulary of color, but I think intuitively for a Western viewer, which is an important distinction, I think intuitively we do understand the meaning behind the choices.
Right. No, when you mentioned one of the paintings, you mentioned Hans Hofmann and that push-pull theory, how
Yeah.
about he used greens and reds, how they played against each other. And then I mentioned Albers because I really fascinated how he used these squares within squares. And those were his signature paintings, just like Rothko has these paintings that you have on the screen now. But I was more concerned with the colors, and also there are no hard edges here versus other painters that did use that to define the edges a little more precisely than he doesn't. They're beautiful. I just love their work. It's just a question that I had. But anyway, thank you.
So what you said about green and red, that's the complementary contrast color theory. So this is a very, very old theory. It was most famously sort of championed by the Impressionists, right? So
Right.
the idea is this: when you use the opposite colors on the color field, the perception is of them being brighter. The luminosity, we perceive them as more luminous because they are next to each other, but the opposite. And these colors are called complementary because they make each other brighter, or we perceive it. So obviously you have this in Rothko. The softer edges, this is a choice that he makes. I think, in my personal opinion, I think it has to do with movement, because in Rothko's paintings, you always have this movement. These multiforms dissolve and coalesce. As we look at them, there's this ceaseless sort of cycle of creation that we are becoming engulfed in. If he were to make the edges hard, that movement would not be there. They would become static. So
Right.
it's part of his aesthetic sort of vision, this sort of becoming, right? The psychology is there to the evocation of movement and the process of creation. Does that answer?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Irina, we have a few things in the chat.
Yes.
Since we're on the Rothko, there's mostly a huge scale for these three artists, but that limits who can own these works. Do you see their smaller scale works as being powerful as the larger ones? Does the large scale make a huge difference in the size?
Okay, so I think these three artists don't, well, maybe de Kooning does, but they mostly do these larger than life monumental works. And the point of these, one of the objectives of these artists is to create this atmosphere of engulfment, right? To make the viewer part of the painting. You can't really do this if it's a small scale painting.
Make sure it's unmuted and say.
I'm sorry, I keep hearing somebody, sorry. So I think it's an interesting point about who can own them. Obviously, you need to have a wall of that size, or it needs to be in sort of a public space, which brings us back to where Pollock started, right? With the mural creation. These paintings, because they are supposed to convey these archetypes of the society, made probably for a large body of people to be seen. I mean, you can also look at it that way.
Yeah. Does that answer the question? Personally, I think it does. Okay.
Lisa,
No,
I
we have another.
Yeah, this is Sheila Moldovan, and I asked
There
the
you are,
question.
okay, yeah.
And what struck me here, there's a quote fairly recently from artist Tom Niskowski, who passed away fairly recently, that he made a deliberate choice to paint in a smaller scale that people like him, if you will, could own on their walls, as opposed to, you know, what he grew up with and what I grew up with when we were both in art school, which were huge, huge paintings, which were very nice to work on, and then you had to have a place to put them. And so that was what prompted the thought. It was, you know, I understand the intention, obviously, with Rothko is to be enormous and to be engulfing, and you know, and that serves to do that. And whatever the reasons were for Pollock is another whole story. But that was what prompted the question, because it does make a difference in terms of the availability, even if you have wealth, if you don't have a barn in which to, you know, put these huge paintings. And that was what prompted the question. But it does make a difference. Obviously, you know, the intent is what's there, certainly from Rothko.
So I think for me, it all goes back to the artistic objective of the artist. So they obviously, they're not, you know, it's a sort of, I don't want to, how should I put this? It's a fairly bourgeois concern. And I don't mean it in a bad way. It's just who is going to own this painting? They do not care because they are much more sort of out there in space. They're dealing with these grandiose ideas, philosophical sort of concepts of the sublime. So I think who is going to own this, who is going to be able to display it, is not even on the sort of on the horizon for them. It's just the difference in the approach. And also, I think if you are concerned with the evocation of the sublime, you have to go big. You can't create miniatures if you're going to talk or convey cosmic powers, for example, like Pollock wants to, or the sublime of the flesh. It has to be, this woman has to be larger than life, because she's not a woman, she's just womanhood, right? And he has sort of subjective vision of it. So I think just the difference of approach. Obviously, all the artists are different. That's like a platitude. Sorry. Yes. Any
Yes,
other
another
question?
comment?
Yes, I have a question and a comment.
Okay.
I don't see myself on the screen or anybody else. My
Oh,
name
we
is
have
Sarah.
another person too, so we'll come back to them in a minute. Okay, go ahead.
Irina, thank you very much. I think it was a very good presentation, sorry. And you conveyed very nicely what abstract expressionism is and how to approach it and to like it. And I think I want to say that you have listened to you many times before. What I like about your presentations is that you have the same enthusiasm for Renoir or Monet and for Krasner or Pollock. And I think that's wonderful that you're able to just approach any style with such, positivity.
Thank you.
I would like you to comment briefly, I know you didn't have much time, about two things. The political atmosphere influence on those painters and the influence of the women around those guys.
So I think I talked a little bit about the women. So the women were, their wives or partners were great artists in their own right, and we underestimated or underexplored their contributions for the longest time, and now we're sort of waking up to the impact. The politics is a very important question, which I didn't discuss at all, but so avant-garde usually is not received well by the older generation, especially if it is such a style as abstract expression. It doesn't really translate well. It doesn't connect well, I think, to the more sort of conventional modes of representation. But what I also wanted to say is that in the 70s, American abstract expressionism was very deliberately used by the CIA to, they sort of opposed the socialist realism of the Soviet Union to the abstract expressionism in America as an example of the freedom of expression. So it's a very interesting thing to think about. Of course, I think I can say that any of these three artists were directly or sort of decipherably responding to the current politics, but they are responding to them nevertheless. They are possible, they became possible, as I was saying, only because we had such huge crises in our history in the West. You have, as I said, for Rofka, for example, the Holocaust was a trauma that he never really survived. He comes from a Jewish family, as I said. They moved to America. He changed his last name several times because he did not want to be seen or perceived immediately as belonging, as being Jewish. And he does sort of, it is known that he was always very nervous about his identity. And so the style that he develops, you can't really separate the man from his language. And this is the way that he talks to the world. He talks through these expansive, sort of abstracted, huge works that communicate through color. So in a way, he's trying to move beyond these fears, beyond these anxieties, and find some sort of a universal commonality that would allow him to build a bridge across this schism, this traumatic destruction, right, that you can't internalize if you are Jewish. So in that sense, and Pollock obviously reacting to the nuclear destruction, which is another horror that becomes part of the Western history, right, in Japan, that you have to somehow survive that historic trauma. For all of them, abstraction becomes the way to do it, becomes the way to reach the sublime, and also to reach these subconscious archetypes from the Jungian philosophy. So it's about really, and ultimately, it's about finding the common ground of humanity, right? So, and that's just the way that they do it. They reach for abstraction as a way to do it. And to your comment that I always have the same sort of enthusiasm, the fact is that I get to pick the artists. When we talk about the artists I don't like. Like I would never have a lecture about Thomas Kincaid, for example.
Okay.
Just, I can't really take credit for the enthusiasm. I pick the guys that I like and girls. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, they're going back to one more comment. It was one of the members has written, I'm wondering what you think about the Joan Mitchell show that is up at the Baltimore Museum and how her work fits into this era.
So I love Joan Mitchell. I haven't seen the show at the Baltimore yet, but I think she is wonderful. She creates these gorgeous sort of garden-like paintings that I adore. And when I did teach a lecture on abstract expressions, when I had like 10 hours to do it, I did talk about Joan Mitchell, and I did put her next to Impressionists as well, because she's also fascinated with the way light works out in nature, and she is very much connected to this idea, just like de Kooning in a way, that reconciles abstraction and figuration. So you can't really tell that they are gardens, but you also can, because they evoke gardens. So there is, I think, a link there as well. So I do really like her.
Irina, I had another quick thing.
Yes.
If I could jump in. We've all heard that sometimes, we've heard in the past that abstract expressionists, were a fraud because their stuff doesn't look like, a flower or a person or a tree. And thank you for sharing that all three of the ones you chose today, had background in art techniques and composition and color theory and attended wonderful art schools, et cetera. So they were accomplished before they made the choice to go in the route they went. Are there any exceptions to that rule? Like, does every abstract expressionist that is of merit have a background in those things, and that help form their thinking? Were there any that didn't have that?
Okay, so I don't know, not all of them had formal education. I would say a lot of them didn't, but there is no exception to the fact that, the ones that you so eloquently put, the ones of merit have this enormous amount of visual literacy, right? You cannot have a great artist who doesn't have the intent, right? You can't think about great artists as though they have accidentally stumbled onto painting, because they consistently produce these very important, very talented statements that encapsulate the moment. The only way you can do this is if you know what you're doing, if your intent can actually be translated into the product. So I think I can't think of any one of them that never opened an art book or never went to a museum. They all studied, and they all sort of came to their conceptual, to their, to formulating a concept of their art by looking. I don't see how it wouldn't be possible otherwise, right? And of course, artists, people sometimes look at art as though it just happens, which I'm sure members of the Rockwell Art League understand that it doesn't just happen. What just happens usually is not that good.
And you can really tell the difference, can't you? Somebody thinks they give a paintbrush to a monkey or an elephant.
You cannot be a Pollock. Just because you're going to put a canvas on the floor, drip some paint on it, you will find out very quickly that it's not going to end up looking as a Pollock does. I mean, obviously, it's my personal opinion.
Dear Q, comments?
Thank you.
I'm sorry?
Q for comments?
What comments?
Am I jumping in? Is there a Q?
Is there a
Go
Q?
ahead, David.
Okay, anyway, I have two comments to make, Dr. Stotland. First of all, I just think it's amazing, and I have studied, de Kooning and his wife. The fact that you found the Venus of Willendorf and compare that to Woman 2, 3, or 4.5 or whatever, it was, to me, it was amazing. I think that was incredible. I mean, how you thought of that, or where you found that?
It's not me.
that was pretty damn good. Okay.
Okay, so it's within the art historical canon of de Kooning. It's not it's not my discovery.
It's not yours. Okay.
No,
Well, I have never had a professor
Yeah.
use that before, and you're the first. The other thing I want to talk about is, just briefly here, is going down to the Phillips. The other participant was talking about size of the work, and it is important, especially if you sit before, if you go down to the east wing of the National and sit before a Rothko, is one up on the screen now. If you sit before it, the size matters because the larger it is, the quicker it draws you into the painting, and the quicker it works around you. And I mean, even without abusing a substance, you can sit in front of a Rothko and really experience something. The other thing is, and the size again adds to that, embellishes that moment you have with the painting. The other thing is that, you know, you can prove complements seek each other by looking at a Rothko painting and then turning to a blank wall. If you, even on the screen here, if you stare at this red-orange rectangle here, and then you look away, you know, you will see its complement. You know, I mean, that's not something that the painter does. It's something that the human eye does, but we understand that. And Rothko was just, and his color field was just, I think, the epitome of color field painting. Clifford Still and the others, I think, came after and really jumped off of Rothko or piggybacked on Rothko for their work. Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. So I think all of these are great points. What I wanted to say, because I forgot to mention it. So I feel like if you want to see Rothko as he's supposed to be seen, you should go to Phillips, because the paintings there are hung the way that he wanted them to be hung, and he actually specified the distance that one should have between his painting and like the bench. So if you go to the Phillips collection, you see that there, I think it's like 16 or 18 inches. You have to, in his plan as far as to be very, very close to the painting, which is why personally, when I go and see Rothko there, I get like tired. There's so much color and it's so powerful that it almost sort of weighs on you that much. I don't know. It sort of dominates you in a lot of ways. So I think, you know, National Gallery also has Rothkos. A lot of museums have Rothkos, but I think the Phillips collection is probably the most impactful space. I haven't been to the Rothko chapel, but these are darker paintings that he has there. Any other questions? And also I love Clifford Still, one of my favorite painters. No more questions?
Irina, thank you so much for enlightening us and giving us this background and enhancing our appreciation of these wonderful artists. Thank you for supporting our group and for doing it year after year, and I hope it never ends. Thank you so much. By the way, remember, you know, if you're interested, you know, she does teach at both the Yellow Barn and Montgomery College.
Not Yellow Barn anymore. Just
okay. Well, Montgomery College were wonderful classes, and they surveys where you can do everything from Rothko to you know, the ancient art of the Renaissance, and you're equally enlightened every time. So thank you. I'm going to end the recording now, and